that the regular school budget doesn't cover, and those are very often arts and music programs and that kind of thing. So if you either buy a raffle ticket, you can win a fabulous prize, or they also just take donations and they have little bonus prizes and things. So please.
Shopping bags and some soon be outlawed.
That's right. Get your shopping bags now while they're hot. So thank you very much, and please give your attention now to Mr. Siegel.
First of all, I want to thank Nora, because when they first invited me here, I said, if I'm coming here alone, there'll be nobody here. So it's nice. Thank you, Nora, for. And I do feel a little awkward because Nora is a professional, has done this for a very long time, and has, had the desire to write since she was 13. And my story is a little different. I had the desire to write all the time, but trapped inside the body of a jock and a different kind of personality. I think my thoughts just kept being stored there and were repressed for lots of years. I started falling in love with writing and being introspective in high school, and two of the teachers that are here today had a big influence on me in that, and I didn't realize that until a lot of years later. Pat Masson is over here, who was my 10th grade English teacher, and Kathy Evans, Kathleen Dietz now, sorry, was my 11th grade English teacher. And the books we read in those classes and the interest they showed in my writing and the way they taught made me realize, and I only shared that stuff with myself, that I really, in somewhere I was an artist, or there was something in there that had something to say or wanted to say, and actually put that in writing. Now, flash forward 35, 40 years, and I had taught school for a while. I got involved in business, raised a family, and just didn't do anything with writing. So I'm big on having coaches and having people help me, and as big as ego as a lot of people think I have, which I do, I always look for help so I can pretend to be smarter than I am, and I always do look for counseling, and I look for people who have done it before and help in terms of if I want to start something. Well, I had finished a business project with a motivational coach I was working with, and he said, Rich, we've kind of gotten where you want it, which is hard to say. What do you want to do next? And I said, I want to write a book. And he looked at me like I was crazy, obviously, because I had never written a word in my life. And he put me in contact with somebody who was a professor at the University of Georgia that had helped him with some of his speeches that he did on the motivational thing. And I've never met her in person, but I talked to her on the phone. And I said, hey, I'm interested in writing. What do I do? She said, well, send me something you've written. And I said, I don't have anything. I haven't written anything. And that's why I was really interested, Nora, seeing you have your notes from back then, because I did write. I even worked for the newspaper and wrote some things creative. I wrote a lot of papers in Mr. Masson and Mrs. Evans' class back then, but I didn't have any of that. I wasn't a saver, unfortunately, or didn't think that was going to happen. So it was hard for me. I wrote something about a trip I went on with my parents to my nephew's wedding in Denver, and it's in this book, and it's the first thing I really ever wrote. And I sent it to her, and she said, it's not bad, but where are you going? What are you going to say? Where's the theme? And I just kept writing without a plan. Unlike Nora, who's writing novels and that are a real story all the way through, my first stories were really just coming of age, growing up, the pain, reflecting back on what that was like. Family, my dad's here today. So it was, for me, starting, and I am really just beginning. I am working on a second piece of work, and it is scattered like this is, and it is, we have some interest in making TV series, and all that stuff is nonsense, I know, but people have approached me and said, this could be like the Wonder Years. So people ask me a lot about what, did you ever see the TV show The Wonder Years?
Sure.
Yeah, and that hit me too, that, there is something there to that, and as the stories I continue to write, that there are TV shows in there, or if it was a movie, they have said that it would be like the Forrest Gump format. where I come into a bar and meet this guy in a cold winter's night and start telling stories and going back to Vietnam, to the 60s, to when we were kids and what it was like. And that brings me to what it was like growing up in New Paltz, because a lot of, Nora, who's written 9 books, it all goes back to where we came from and the people who influenced us here and the places and the everything that's around us, including the attitudes and the culture of that time, and it never leaves us. I think you know that if you grew up in this town and you look back being a college town, it was more progressive or cosmopolitan than the same tiny little towns throughout America. There was a different ring to New Paltz because of the college. And I think, and in the 60s, the college was a symbol of the hippie culture, the drug culture maybe, or whatever, that a more progressive era that little towns like Highland, Marlboro, throughout the country weren't experiencing the same things that we were in New Paltz. We were exposed to a lot more. And at that time, I was the type of person, I was interested in it all and thought about it all, but didn't do anything really. I liked it, I liked observing it, but my mind was in other places. So one of the things, back to when I was talking to my writing coach, she said, write about New Paltz, write about growing up, write about your family now, reflecting back on what those times were. And it was, when all of us are young, I think, back to Nora, all her writing is about, she writes young adult books. It's about that intense period of her life. I'm 55, Nora's probably 54. We're going back to that intense time. And that's what the stories are about. That intense time when you're learning about things for the first time. You're falling in love for the first time. You're forming an idea of what your parents are like and what you want to be like as a parent. You're forming ideas of what you want to do. There can be no more intense time than that. So when you look at people and you listen to Nora, who's a well-grounded, successful person, and the pain she still remembers is the pain we all had in one way or another. Whether it was you're overweight, whether it was your family's income wasn't at, whatever it was, there was stuff we carried around. Nora's parents dying, a mother, committing suicide. For me, it wasn't that, but it was the family dynamics. I didn't meet up to the expectations of what my brother was doing. I wasn't as smart as him. I didn't go to as good a college as him. My SAT scores stunk. I wasn't as good in sports as I thought I was. There's a million things that in your own little world of what you expect, and at some point it hits you in the face that, hey, this is what it is, and where do I want to go from here? And that's what I write about, and at least what I'm going to continue to write about for now is back then, reflecting back, what it's like now, and I'm going to read from a story that is about a family in New Paltz that lived next door to us. Like Nora, I'm learning everything as I'm going. I definitely was advised to change the names, and the names are changed in this story. It is about a young man who went to New Paltz High School in the 60s and was drafted into the Vietnam War. And the story is about what happened to the family and looking back, what my reflections were on what their son going to Vietnam did to that family and the impact of what the 60s were like and what it was like. And then later in the story, I go back and talk about looking at it now. What was my perspective as an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, and then what is my, looking back, what was the perspective? So I'm going to read from the beginning of that story. It's called The Wall, and as I read, you'll know why. But it was the reference and the metaphoric reference, obviously, to the Vietnam Wall in Washington D.C. and the stone wall that was between my house and where Hank Schaller lived. And I don't see, I think I was supposed to play golf with John Schulte this afternoon, but it's his brother that we're talking about here. A double-row stone wall runs between my childhood home and the Schaller family property. Over 100 years ago, before the days of electronic title searches and aerial maps, landowners spent countless hours constructing the walls to clearly define their territory. At age 8, I saw the wall for the first time. This landmark that separated my family from our neighbors on one side and in the woods in the back. My great-grandfather, a first-generation German immigrant, arrived at Ellis Island and became proprietor of a summer boarding house used by fellow countrymen as a summertime getaway. He owned enough property to gift his son and his grandson their own parcel. On their piece of land, my parents built their dream home where I grew up and where my 80-year-old dad still lives. You are 80, right? You complained about that a little bit. In late June 1968, we moved into our new home, and I sat on the stone wall surveying the unfamiliar surroundings. I was hoping to catch sight of any of the eight Schaller children out at play, especially one that was close to my age. My older brother was a great playmate when it suited him, which as he got older became less and less frequent. Instead of a herd of children, what I saw was a scene that is like a snapshot in time. I had no idea who Norman Rockwell was, but years later recognized his setting could have been captured in one of his famous paintings. I intently watched a teenage boy meticulously washing his car. He wore a bright white, freshly laundered t-shirt and a pack of cigarettes safely stored in the sleeve. His faded blue jeans were rolled at the cuff, enough to show off the black Ked sneakers. What I remembered most was how handsome he was, with his blonde hair slicked back and a tanned face glistening in the early summer sun. To my imaginative self, he was a James Dean look-alike, coolly shining his big black pointed chariot with an amazing sense of pride and purpose. Something about the way he focused intently on the car as he rinsed the white suds told me he had places to go and people to see. The apparition turned out to be Hank Jr., one of the oldest of Hank and Barbara Schaller's children. It's odd, but the childhood memory is one of my earliest, and as strange as it may seem, the image has become clearer as the years have passed. What is even odder is that I never remember seeing him again. I never remember seeing him again, and after that day, I don't remember ever meeting Hank Jr. and never found out what he was dreaming of. I never knew what his hobbies were or if he ever kissed a girl. His younger brother, Jeff, and I became fast playmates and were steady friends throughout high school. In spite of our closeness, I can't recall either of us mentioning his older brother. No record, no tribute, no mention of such a shining youthful star. He simply disappeared. The first summer in my new house, I spent a lot of time with the Schaller family. Having only one brother and one cousin, I knew very little about life in a large family. The Schallers were a close-knit brood, connected even more tightly through their devout Catholic faith and tradition. I can still see the picture of Jesus Christ prominently displayed in the kitchen. Besides Hank Jr., the 7 other children ranged in ages from 3 to 16, 4 boys and 3 girls. The Schaller house was full of activity and noise, plenty of noise. Mrs. Schaller was an old-fashioned housewife, and being a mom of 8 was her full-time job. Dinner was served family style and began the moment Hank Jr. pushed his way through the door. Mr. Schaller was a strapping, gregarious man who stood about 6'2" and weighed close to 300 pounds. I never heard him described as fat, but his combined chest and stomach resembled a large barrel. You knew Hank Schaller, he was a big man, really big man. I must have eaten 20 meals that summer at Schaller's, and nobody seemed to mind that my presence meant less food to go around. I learned that if you grew up with lots of siblings, you had to be both selfish and unselfish at the same time. Selfish to make sure you dug your fork into the platter to get some food before it was all gone, and unselfish enough to not take too much so that there would be food left for everyone. Before any grabbing for chow, Mrs. Schaller always said grace. Mostly she thanked God and usually asked for a few favors. But there was only one request she asked of God every single night. But most of all, Lord, I beg you to keep our beautiful son, Hank, safe wherever he may travel. Amen. My parents' explanation was that Hank Jr. won or lost some sort of lottery that summer. His draft number was picked 6th out of 365, and because of that, he was going on a trip overseas, courtesy of the United States Army. Dad told me the name of the country where Hank was going, but since I'd never heard of it, it did not register for a long time. That explained our government needed Hank and many other young men to go fight against people who were enemies of the United States. The spring of the following year was more welcome than usual because the winter of 1969 dumped record-breaking snowfalls on New Paltz. By April, there was still some semblance of ice left from the taller drifts. During the winter and spring, about once a week, just before dinner time, my mom sent me to the showers loaded with platters of food. I dreaded the trek again across the wall. For a previously loud and boisterous family, the stillness I encountered at the house still haunts me. From the beginning of these food-laden trips, I found Mrs. Schaller sitting motionless at the table. She never acknowledged my presence, and the only indication that she was alert was when she reached for her half-empty glass of clear liquid that sat in front of her. She picked up the glass and stared at it as if looking for something. Without expression, she caressed the rim with her lips and drank tiny sips. Jesus was missing from his place of honor on the wall. In contrast, Mr. Schaller was jovial and especially welcoming. "Put it down right here, Richie, my boy," he bellowed in a friendly yet stern voice. "Have you been telling your mom and dad that Barbara and I really appreciate their help?" "I have, Mr. Schaller. They said you're welcome and let them know whatever else is needed." "We've got great neighbors, don't we, Barbara?" he always retorted with a touch of a slur in his own words. Mrs. Schaller continued staring blankly into her glass as if no one else was in the room. "Bye, Mr. Schaller. Tell Jeff he can come over and play later," I said, and anxiously scurried out the door. As far as I know, Mrs. Schaller never cooked another meal, washed another load of clothes, or prayed another word to Jesus. In the remainder of time that I knew her, she had nothing more than sit at the kitchen table. After a while, she went away to live in what was described as a resting home. A strong, well-grounded religious woman with 7 children to take care of simply quit. She gave up on her family, she surrendered her own life, and she turned her back on God. One day a happy-go-lucky housewife, the next a mute, crazed, and distant lady. I'm going to stop there, but it goes on, and you get the point, and the idea that Henry died in Vietnam, he was killed February 1st, which was a day after my 9th birthday, 1969. He was killed on a reconnaissance mission on the Vietnam trails, and I did a lot of research on it. And they were just going on a mission that they thought was safe, and they were ambushed. And there were 14 people in his battalion, and 8 of them were killed on that day. So at the time, the story is really about what it means to me now. And I go on to write about how little I understood then of what it meant, and how unappreciative I have been of my life, and what he missed, and what all people missed who die senselessly in a war, and what the cause is for, and how people try to explain what the cause is for. This story is more about what Hank missed, and what we've all had the opportunity to have, and that at 19 to lose your life on a trail in South Vietnam, it's mind-boggling as I get older. And the story goes on to when I went to the Vietnam War with my children and was standing there. And I had been there when I was a teacher in the 8th grade on a field trip, and went and acted like a big shot. I was 22 then, and said, "Hey, my neighbor's on the wall," and pointed it out to him, and wasn't laughing, but was like, "Hey, look, I know somebody," and went to the panel where Henry Schulte Jr.'s name was, and just kind of moved on. And it was 4 years ago. Sorry. I went there with my kids, and I showed them that. And it changed my life a lot at that moment. It really did. So that's what I'm writing about there. On a lighter note, I'm doing some more writing that is based on, because I've been asked to, about stories from when I was younger and kind of going backwards. And I did 5 little short stories, blogs on my years as a teacher, which were emotional, and writing about that because I taught for 7 years. Then I went back and wrote a piece about being in college and what that was like, and some of the experiences I had there. And again, hopefully all half an hour TV show, you know, each one. That's what I have in mind when I'm writing it. And then I just started doing something on New Paltz directly in the high school. And I wrote something, the first piece is about my first day in high school. And Nora was, because a couple people have commented on the blogs on Facebook, well, that didn't happen, and it relates to all of my stories they're 95% what I remember, and still what I remember is a long time ago, and some of the things like I talk about in the story about Hank Schaller, I think looking back, I overdid how dramatically the mother took it, but in my impression then was that the mother abandoned, but I think, you know, she turned out where she recovered and was a lot better. The family struggled. So some of those things I struggle with when I'm writing this stuff, and when hearing those things, I want to be accurate, I really do, but I'm also telling a story. And really it's the message that I'm trying to get across, not so much the exact details. These are not documentaries, they're not, you know, exact sciences. I try to research it, and a lot of it I'm going on memory. This is on memory. And it's the first day of school, of high school. The yellow school bus made its way up Main Street, glided up the hill past the downtown bar section of the village of New Paltz. Pete, the bus driver, was paying no attention to the 30-mile-per-hour speed limit or the deafening sound of the screaming chants. Pete is a dope. He ate a bottle of soap. Bubbles here, bubbles there, bubbles in his underwear. Imagine I can remember that. That's what's always said. And that, we had to be doing that. For me to, I couldn't create that. It was early September 1974, and I was staring out of the window into the morning light, headed to my first day of school, high school. Not a single cell phone, iPad, or computer was occupying the attention of the passengers. Their focus was directed toward the chorus of taunts they had created for individuals as they reached their bus stop. Matt, 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 for Matt Robinson. Hayne is a pain, Hayne is a pain, Hayne is a pain, was greeted for John Hayne. There were more. I didn't write that, but there were more. Further up Main Street was Pat and George's, one of New Paltz's most famous landmarks. On the same side of the street as my window. For 7 a.m., I was perplexed that the bar appears crowded with mostly men who aren't exchanging any dialogue, but merely glaring down at the shot glasses in front of them. The big yellow vehicle continues rolling through the village, finding its way to North Putt Corners and my immediate future. My big brother Gary was entering his senior year and drove his 1972 Ford Pinto filled with friends to school, but refused to make room for his little brother. True. He's not here, so anyway. He spent the summer abroad as an exchange student in South Africa, and the sudden change in his demeanor and physical appearance was staggering. My undersized, gawky bro had returned home from a handsome young man, confident and much bigger in every way. 2 days prior to the opening of school, he hosted a big beer bash at our house. Remember that? You do. You're nodding yes. I couldn't believe my prepubescent eyes, beer kegs, roach clips, and seemingly endless stream of 17-year-old girls, soon to be seniors. Lucy Schaefer and Patty Ralph stood out the most at that pre-high school celebration. They were the two girls in particular who paid a lot of attention to me, or at least that's what I thought in my newfound alcohol-infused state. 2 days before I began high school, I was drunk for the first time, fell in love twice, and learned a lesson that both alcohol and girls were false friends. That first day of New Paltz High School, I was like a kid entering the Magic Kingdom for the first time. The village of New Paltz had always maintained a reputation as a progressive, liberal environment where booze, drugs, and sex flowed freely. Still, I was surprised by the independence that the high school seemed to allow its students. There were open study halls, which meant there wasn't a teacher on duty to keep track of where you were. You remember that we had those? Did they stick with those? It was great. If you were on an athletic team, you could opt out of gym but still get credit for it. The cafeteria was full of a wide variety of food options, including complete breakfast for those who had open periods in the morning. The most shocking thing looking back was our smoking lounge. a space just outside the classroom where the students of all ages could go and light up. In the early fall, with the windows ajar, I could sit in Bert King's economics class and breathe in some secondhand smoke in an attempt to get high on the other clouds that filtered through the air. On my first stroll through the halls of New Paltz High, I got the feeling that they had just moved the recent party at my house inside the walls of the school. The 1960s and all that went along with those years was still fresh in the minds and attitudes of the teenagers of New Paltz. Our hair was long, the big bell bottoms protected us against high waters, and both girls and boys sported a lot of rawhide jewelry. At 14, I was fascinated with free love and drugs and the easygoing attitude that went along with the hippie culture. But being labeled as a jock coming from a conservative family made it challenging for me to get closer beyond the fringe to all the expectations of that exploration of that era. Staying in tune with the times, there was a general assembly every year on the first day of school. Ken Salinger, our on-again, off-again principal, welcomed us to the lazy and hazy world. I said that because I remember we had protests at times, like they were going to fire him, and then the students left the school and that was great because we were outside picking it or whatever. We did all kinds of stuff like that. When I was teaching, none of that. It was a lot different. But anyway, on again, off again, lazy, hazy day in our high school. In that particular assembly, I remember seeing the larger-than-life seniors who I had watched on the athletic fields and party at my house, gathered to demonstrate to the underclassmen what cool looked like. Pete Shazza, Jay Egan, Roger Plantier, Mike Beck were godlike figures as they sat in the back row, adorned in their football jerseys. But what I recall the most about that assembly was when English and theater teacher Richard Catabiani got up to announce the few students who would perform their artistic talents. Amy Silverman sat on a stool in front of the student body with only a guitar in hand and started to sing. My father sits at night with no lights on. His cigarette glows in the dark. The living room is still, no reply. Began the lyrics of the inspiring rendition of Carly Simon's hit song, The Way I Always Heard It Should Be. It took me 30 years to act on it, but after hearing Amy's voice echo through the auditorium, I knew I wanted to be an artist. They did have actual classes and some good teachers at New Paltz. Mrs. Evans, Fran. My brother was a very good student, and the game of school came easily to him. He was very sharp in math and the sciences and was headed to the Ivy League to be an engineer after graduation. I always looked up to Gary and was proud of him, but his academic prowess placed a self-imposed pressure on myself that took many years to overcome. My first period class was Earth Science, and despite the fact that George Campbell was an excellent teacher, I had zero desire to understand what made the world go round. Next came Ron Noli's algebra class. Considering I was a whiz in mathematics through middle school, I was amazed at how fast I became ignorant in math. On the first day when Mr. Noli put A plus B equals C on the board, I could see my days as an honor student were done. Really, once they started with letters. I'm not kidding. Couldn't do it. Going into Miss Hicks' English class, Dick, Evans, Dietz, she's sitting right here. Going into Miss Hicks' English class, I got a glimmer of hope that my academic career was going to not be a complete disaster. And this is a little embellishing here because I didn't have her as a freshman, so I just, made it that way. Again, because I get called on this stuff. You didn't have Miss Evans as a freshman. Okay, I get it. She put a syllabus of the book and paper assignments on the blackboard, and the class let out a collective groan. While my classmates moaned, I focused on the reading list. The Lord of the Flies, The Great Gatsby, Animal Farm, Atlas Shrugged, Macbeth. I had heard of them all, and over the year I read each one cover to cover. I very much liked each one of them, but Gatsby was by far my favorite. It didn't take me long to figure out that English was my favorite subject, Miss Hick was my favorite teacher, and I was an in-the-closet bookworm. It was mid-afternoon and my ride was now making its way down Main Street in my hometown. Like the morning, Pete was back at the helm, but the mood on the bus was very different. No one was calling Pete a dope. There were no more chantings of any kind as the passengers were dropped off. Everyone sat with 4 or 5 books in their laps. For a school bus full of high school students, it was eerily quiet with only the sound of reflection. Our bus got caught up in traffic right in front of Pat and George's. I peered through the window as I had hours before, and it was obvious the bar clientele had rotated. The crowd was happier and younger. The doors were open and I could hear the music coming from inside. Unlike on the ride to school, the street was filled with young college students navigating their way around their new domicile. Right before we were through town and entering the flats across the bridge, I looked to the mountains at the old familiar site of the Mohonk Tower that loomed above where my home was located. It was September 4th, 1974, just another day in the little college town of New Paltz. It was clear to me that this day had been the precursor to how my world was changing. But for the moment, on that day, I was going home. Thanks, and I think, Nora, we're going to ask a couple.